This conference will now be recorded.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another ABH DEI Committee Table Talk. My name is Danielle Young, and I'm from the Greenbelt office. The purpose of these videos is to explore race in America. And this is actually our fourth installment of this conversation. We always start the conversation off with a very interesting and necessary question. When did you know you were? And so for this series, we're asking about the Middle Eastern culture. So I'm going to start the conversation off. When did you know you were Middle Eastern or of Middle Eastern culture or categorized as other?
Hi everyone. My name is Haya. Haya Murar. I work at the Frederick office. I am the billing supervisor. I've been with ABH for 3 years, going in my fourth. I am from the Middle East. I am Palestinian. I've been in the US for more than, I think, 22 years now. And Middle Eastern aren't all Muslims. We have Christian Arabs, Christian Muslim Arabs. We have Jewish Arabs. They live all around the Middle East. They're not necessarily a Muslim when you hear the word the Middle East. And the Middle East covers Northern Africa, covers Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, Syria, Jordan. So this is all the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf area. So this is all the Middle East. Being labeled as me as a Muslim, the first time I honestly felt it about 10 years ago. It wasn't around September 11th, honestly. It was way after September 11th. And when I was attacked by an older lady at the mall, where she basically told me, I am not wanted here and I need to take my kids and leave. I honestly didn't know what to say. It was the first time ever. Even around September 11th, no one ever said anything to me, but that was really weird and strange. And she was much older, very old. So what do you say to that? I honestly didn't say anything. I looked at her and I'm like, are you talking to me? No one ever said anything like that to me throughout my school, my work. No one ever said anything like that to me. I just brushed it off, honestly. But it hit back again 4 years ago, the Trump era, where we really abused. Me and my kids were really abused. My kids were abused at the school. We were called all kinds of names. I was attacked here on 7th Street by teenagers. I was attacked here in Walkersville by a white guy in his truck. He called me all kinds of names. It's really weird. And my son was called a terrorist. A note was left on his desk. And it says on it, terrorists don't belong here. And he was attacked again at the camp. He was doing, they were scouting in the mountains with the scouts. One of the kids told him, terrorists do not celebrate Christmas. It's just different stories. And that is where we have to sit down, me and my kids, and talk and explain to the kids that not all Muslims are terrorists. Not terrorism does not present Islam, and Islam is not terrorism. We are Americans, we are Arab, we are Muslim. We are proud of our culture. We are proud where we come from, and we just need to brush these people off. We're not going to pay attention to them. They don't present America. They don't present white people. We were really attacked by white people only. They weren't Hispanic, they weren't Black, they weren't anything. Just white people, and here in Walkersville.
Mm-hmm.
May I ask what motivated you and your family to move here from Palestine?
What motivated us? Uh, I was really young when I moved. I think I was 18 years old with my family. My family does not live here; they live in Florida. I would say better living. I mean, we live in a war zone. I grew up in a war zone.
Exactly.
So yeah, so we had to leave, and we got here. We went. All of us went to school. We got married. We have a good life here, honestly. I do miss Palestine. I do go visit every couple of years, but our life mainly here.
I think that Haya brought up a lot of really interesting points, kind of like about the Middle Eastern experience. I think for many years, maybe before 9/11, and even with some relativity after 9/11, before Trump, Middle Easterns in the U.S. like kind of lived with a type of invisibility. I think in a lot of ways. I think that many times we move through spaces and a lot of us are like ethnically ambiguous or white passing. And so like there's not as much in terms of interaction with strangers unless you're covered or wearing a scarf or something like that. There's less interaction with sort of like the racism that comes from strangers. And I think there's when I was thinking about that question, like when did I first know I was Middle Eastern, I was like, that I don't even think that question really applies to our community, because in a lot of ways, like, so I remember, so I'm half Spanish and I grew up super Spanish, speaking Spanish, really knowing my Spanish culture, my Spanish family. And then I'm half Middle Eastern, I'm half Armenian. And I didn't know that family, mostly because many of them perished in the genocide, and like the one that made it to the US is now dead. So I think a lot of Middle Eastern people also have that story of being really removed from community, or having sort of a lot of like our people far away, again playing into the sort of invisibility in that culture. But I was thinking about like, when did I first know? And the answer is like, I don't know that I ever was like, I'm Middle Eastern, partially because I remember as a kid looking at where Armenia was on the map and being like, oh, I'm Asian. And then realizing like, oh, there's an idea of what Asian means and I don't fit that. And then later being like, oh, that's really confusing. And then moving to Armenia and being like, oh, I get it. I'm Armenian, like understanding what that meant sort of for me. But also in the Middle East, Armenians have like a really tough history. And also, like Haya said, we're one of the only sort of Christian people, not one of the, where there's a Christian minority and we are one of them. And so there's sort of like less understanding that. So we feel really isolated as this community to some extent, even though we're all over the place. And I think also more recently, as I've been started to be involved in like communities as an adult, like there's actually a push away from the term Middle Eastern because it's a term of colonization, right? Middle East is sort of in reference to Europe, or between Asia and Europe, the Middle East. And it's, I think for our community, having sort of ownership over the land and the space and who we are as a people, not in relation to whiteness, not in relation to Europe, is really important. And so currently, I don't know if people know this, I think this is really sort of important. People are starting to identify as SWANA, SWANA, Southwest Asian North African, as like sort of a larger umbrella term for people from that area. There's a push to put SWANA on the census because Middle Eastern people don't know how to identify in the census. So some people are clicking white, some people are clicking others. And there's huge communities, especially immigrant communities on the East and West Coasts, that are really underserved because there's no, again, that invisibility, there's no recognition that they're there because there's no category for us.
Yeah.
And then, a lot of admissions teams in California and on schools are now starting to count SWANA as like a race or ethnicity as well. So anyway, to sum it up, I think that question is really hard for our community. When did you first know? Because it's not as clear, and we live in this kind of like in between in a lot of ways. In between whiteness and brownness, I think in between Europe and Asia, I think in between American and not American. And so I don't know, I've always felt that there's a characterization of like, otherness as in like an in-betweenness for us, and it's not as clear. So I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Right, Nina, you bring up a really good point about, like you say, the otherness or the in-between. And I love this new categorization of SWANA. I've not heard of that before, but I think this is a very necessary conversation to understand. Sometimes it's not just Black or white or Hispanic, but we have also those others, or the otherness of wanting to be able to identify your culture, identify who you are in America, but there still is that push-pull or that in-between feeling of which way would I go, also wanting to identify with exactly who you are from a cultural perspective. And then also, just from highest perspective as well, just the trauma, even experience in your own country from one to another, being in a place of, I think it was already mentioned, is invisibility, except for when things are heightened in the United States, considering 911 and the Trump era, which we'll get to in just a few moments. But Nikki, what are your thoughts about your experiences in the United States and identifying as either Middle Eastern or other, or what is just your experience?
Well, I also was reflecting on this question a lot the last few days, and I was thinking, I don't know if I ever remember a time knowing a Middle Eastern, but I'm from Iran. My family, I'm half Iranian, and actually mostly Iranian and then European, French as well. But we had a revolution and we were all dispersed. My family, we had to get political asylum and we moved to England, the UK. And I remember the first thought that I was other was I was in boarding school and we were all about to leave for the summer. And they said, okay, we're going to have a competition and see who gets tanned the most at the end of summer when everybody gets back. But I was not allowed to enter because I was naturally darker. And at the time, I kind of understood, like, especially English people are quite pale, so they get red quite easily, so I understood, but it was still, I felt like an outsider. I felt I didn't belong. And one of the other things that in England I found was that I was called Paki. Paki, I believe, it's a derogatory term toward Pakistanis, but in England, they use it as a derogatory word for kind of any Middle Eastern, anyone from that area. I knew it was an insult when I was called it, but I wasn't really quite sure what it meant. And then I moved here, and as Nina said, we're white passable. I can pass for anything. I can pass for in between, Hispanic, Greek, Middle Eastern, Italian. So that wasn't an issue. But when 9/11 happened, I remember kind of being profiled at the airport, being taken to another room, being questioned. I remember going into Delhi and actually a Muslim man started berating me for not being Muslim, because what I wanted to actually point out is that in Iran, first of all, we have many different races. We have white with blonde and blue-eyed, green-eyed. We have black. We have many different races, but also many religions. We have a large Iranian Jewish community, Christian, Muslim. I myself was brought up in a non-religious family, so we do not observe Islam. We are more spiritual, maybe believe in God, but we don't assign to any particular religion. And this man was berating me for not following Muslim ideologies and laws, which was very surprising. After 9/11, that's not the person that I think I was expecting to get more discrimination from white Americans or non-Middle Easterns. it's, I think the thing that really astounds me most is that, you know, Iranians get called terrorists. Politicians such as Trump use Iranians as terrorists, but there has been not one known Iranian terrorist. So, you know, most of the time they're from Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, you know, and it's very bothersome to me because, you know, this propaganda gets passed and then it doesn't just affect people who live outside Iran, but the citizens who live in Iran and suffer the consequences because of politics. And the need for power and oil and resources. So for me, that is you know, what's been going on in the Middle East has been, you know, many, many years, and it's very complex. I mean, just the situation, I'm sure Haya can talk about this, between Israel and Palestine. It's very complex. And sometimes I become very frustrated with kind of it being one-sided, especially in the US. You know, there's not enough conversation or not enough information being disseminated, is that the word, about Palestinians and their strife. So even though I'm not Palestinian, it's actually something I'm very passionate about, and I'm really glad that Haya is here.
And we appreciate all of you being here. And I really want to stick to that point about the dynamics of what is happening in the United States in these different eras where you otherwise would not hear about things or current events of the Middle Eastern culture or the happenings until it has something to do with the United States. I want to stick to that point, but we also have our Assistant Clinical Director here with us, Wendy Greer. Wendy, what are your thoughts so far on the conversation that we're having?
I think for me, it's United States and maybe also around the world, people's obsession to put people in categories. Like, we are not able just to accept that Nikki's American, Haya's American, Nina's American. Like, we have to figure out like where you're from and who you are and what does that all mean? And I think, you know, it's tragic to me that we're still having these conversations. I mean, as a Black American, I can relate to the theme of being invisible. So, you know, when we talk about our culture and, you know, what happened with George Floyd and how many people of all cultures took to the streets. And then there's that whole debate about, well, are you protesting and why does it turn into a riot? And rioting is, you know, I'm not going to quote this correctly, but from Dr. King, people who are not being hurt riot, because that's how you get your point across when you're burning something down or breaking a store window or looting or any of those things. But it's all this theme of, I want to put you in a category, but let me remind you that you're not as important as other people. And it's just interesting. And when we have these conversations, we can see how it all crisscrosses into different cultures. And I'm happy you guys are being very open and honest about it, debunking some myths about terrorism. And, you know, Nikki, what you said, that it was never anybody from Iran. And you and Haya were like shaking your head like, yeah, it's really these other countries. And that, but we lump everybody in one thing instead of like trying to get to know the culture, trying to get to know the person. So this is why we're doing these kinds of table talks to make people aware and to make people like, you know, stop doing those kinds of things. Get to know the person, get to know the culture. You know, we're all Americans right here. We love this country as much as anybody else. So.
Exactly.
One thing that I think is so interesting to put it in the American context, right? Because we can have an experience of being Middle Eastern like within our countries, but I think what's really interesting and important to talk about here is the way that it gets understood in the United States is through the racial lens of the United States,
Right.
which is a very colorist lens, right? Because of the history of slavery and the dynamic of like white versus Black people. And so even people that don't fit into either of those categories somehow get seen through that lens. Like I related a lot to what you were talking about, Nikki, with like the not being able to participate in the tanning contest. I've always a very big important part of my racialized experience, in addition to invisibility, was like confusion, being asked like what I was all the time growing up, constantly, where are you from, and me saying Boston and that not being the right answer, you know. Me being like, but or being told you speak really good English. So again, I think this idea of sort of seeing through a colorist lens is really interesting, because you also see that within propaganda, like you were talking about, or media's portrayal of Middle Easterns. When somebody is doing something good, like we have no idea that they're Middle Eastern. There are so many celebrities that are Middle Eastern that we have no idea, because they are categorized as white because they're considered famous and palatable and understood, right? Like Cher. Does anybody know she's Middle Eastern? She's Middle Eastern, right?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, she's Armenian. But anyways, but then we think about when there's someone famous who is Middle Eastern, like Saddam Hussein, for example. Nobody would ever call that person white. Tell me somebody in this country who would call Saddam Hussein white. Do you know what I mean? So there's this really interesting characterization of like white versus Middle Eastern based on how Middle Easterns are performing, and if they're doing good, and if they're palatable, and they're being the right kind of minority. And if they do that, then they're considered white. And I mean, it's just this really sort of toxic racial lens that I think gets put on immigrants to the country as well, and is really different and confusing than how people exist within their home country. And I think and someone in the last talk talked about that being from Brazil, and I think it's really true as well for Middle Easterns. Like we don't fit in the racial lens of America in a lot of ways. So
I mean, Nina, just to say, when 9/11 happened, and Danielle can probably jump in, Black America was like, ooh, for once, no one's looking at us and blaming us for X, Y, and Z, because it is that good versus bad. And when something in our culture is bad, then all of us are bad. And that happens to everybody else's culture. So that's another, thing that Americans need to get off of.
Right. And I can speak to that really briefly. You know, of course, 9/11 was tragic for our country. And again, as we spoke about before, it's interesting how you blend in, or there's this idea of invisibility, or just ethnic ambiguity when there's nothing going on. But as soon as something happens, you're immediately identified either with your country or the stereotyped parts and pieces and propaganda, as we've already mentioned, of a specific country. But one thing, Wendy, you might be able to comment on this too. When the DC sniper in this area happened, the first thing we also go to is this person, unfortunately, and I also have fallen into that stereotype of this person can't be American, or this person, can't be Black. And it turns out that the person who was the culprit, as well as his protege, was a person of darker skin, or of a Black background. And so, absolutely, Nina, you bring up such a great point about even how, all the way up to the ranks of Hollywood, how you're identified as this good versus bad when it comes to these racial tropes and these racial stereotypes of being able to pass. That's a conversation even in the Black community, but being able to pass for white, or assuming whiteness and denying your cultural or ethnic background. And so as we move the conversation on, it's been so good. We've talked about trauma. We've even talked about the revolutions in the different countries. We've talked about profiling. We've talked about even the different dynamics within religion and categorizing the way that one worships from what we are talking about as the Middle East, or Swana, as Nina has already mentioned, and also propaganda. But because we are also therapists, or we're also clinicians, or we work within this community, I kind of want to steer the conversation over into how does your experience, whether it's been a traumatic experience as you've been able to disclose today, or how have you turned it into an empowering focus when it comes to being able to serve the community and serve clients?
Shall I go first?
Sure.
Okay. So one of the things is because, of the revolution, many Iranians were dispersed, and we had to kind of make our home in other countries. And it wasn't just going to one country and settling. A lot of people moved around a lot. So as a therapist, I am very good at adapting and empathizing with different experiences. And I can help people who have maybe experienced the same thing or maybe lived here all their life, but they don't belong to the white majority group. And their culture, whether they speak English or, they're from a family who doesn't speak English, so let's say Hispanics or Asians, there's an understanding of being able to having to adapt to the majority culture, having to kind of hold on to the traditions of your culture or the pressures of your family, while also, acclimating to the culture here, the main culture. It is a difficult thing to navigate. As a therapist, I feel like it's one of my strengths and something I can kind of help clients with. And on top of that, clients who live here, but their families don't live here. So that separation, that feeling of isolation, the cultural isolation, even things as minor as music or film, or that community is not as prevalent. Although it's gotten so much better. I mean, we have a lot of pockets of Iranian communities throughout the United States. But one other point I want to make, which is not about therapy, but that, when people think Middle Easterns, I feel like in America, there's a lot of kind of, I don't know if I want to say ignorance, but they're not taught geography. So they lump everybody together as Arab. Okay, Arabs. And if I say to them, I am from Iran, I'm not Arab, they're either confused and they're like the same thing. It's the same thing. Or Iraq.
You're Arab, you're automatically Muslim.
Right.
But you're not.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Christian Arabs live in Palestine.
Exactly.
It's another example of A, ignorance, I'm going to say it, and B, it's just stereotypes that I'm just going to lump this entire population under Arab.
It's so frustrating. We don't speak the same language. We don't have the same alphabet. We don't have the same religion, culture. It's extremely, and I'm not saying, I'm not degrading Arabs. I'm just saying there has to be more education.
Education. It is all about education.
Right, about the world.
I think to kind of tie what everybody's saying together, I have an interesting story. One of my first, I think a lot about what it's like to be a Middle Eastern therapist and what my journey as that has been. I think what's really interesting, what was really formative for me was my first internship as a therapist was at the VA, because I'm really, really passionate about working with PTSD and I really want to work with vets. Now, as a Middle Eastern person working with vets, that's a really, really specific thing. I cannot tell you the level of racism that I experienced and heard at the VA, not just from other clinicians and social workers, but from my clients in session, right? I mean, even stuff that in terms of talking about those people and it's difficult because you're working with someone on their trauma, right? But some of their trauma is about killing people who look like you. I mean, it was this really sort of formative experience. And, I think a lot about, I think we all should think about how do we bring our identity to the work as therapists? How do we bring who we are? And I think for Middle Easterns and other sort of light-skinned brown people or ethnically ambiguous brown people, we have this weird thing within therapy where we can disclose what we are or we can't. And we think a lot about whether, how that's going to serve the client or not. I remember this one this one moment in one of my therapy sessions at the VA. The VA, this vet walked in and he said, "You don't look like one of them regular Spanish women. You look like an Arab, Iranian, Indonesian." And I was,
My goodness.
and I remember being like, I don't even know how to process what I just heard. like, and so then you're also in this space in a therapy session where you're confused and kind of wounded, like trying to sort of contextualize what just happened, but also trying to create a therapeutic space. And I think that sort of, again, the invisibility, the then coming out as Middle Eastern thing is so relevant to how we practice therapy. But I think on the flip side, I really, really identified with what you said, Nikki, which is like, because of that fluidity, that invisibility, that thing, we have this incredible ability to adapt and be flexible and understand experience and connect with immigrants from all kinds of places. And I think that does really serve us as clinicians. And I know for sure, I've had clients tell me that is one of the parts of what I bring to the therapeutic space that makes it safe for them. So to answer your question, Danielle, I mean, I think that there's a really, really important place for therapists of like SWANA ethnicities. And I think that there's not enough visibility for us. There's not enough community for us. There's almost no education in social work or psychology schools on how to serve SWANA populations at all. I can't tell you in grad school how much I was like, but what about SWANA? But what about the Middle East? But what, you know what I mean? And so I think part of it too is about like visibility and us being more vocal and being like, hi, we're a different community, and hi, we're not all Arab, and we're not all Muslim, and we're not whatever, you know what I mean? But we do have a really specific cultural heritage that binds us together that we're really proud of, that we bring to the therapeutic space. And here are some best ways to serve us, and here are some best ways to sort of like lift up therapists of SWANA descent. So
yeah. I also feel that, as you said, Nina, we have the privilege of passing. Okay, so we don't, our culture, our race is not right in your face. So you can choose as a therapist whether to share that information. And I often find that, I want to be that source of exposure, to be a good example for someone to say, oh, I knew an Iranian, and she was like this. She wasn't like a terrorist at all, So there most of my clients, if they ask me or if I feel like it's appropriate, I will tell them so that I can kind of share that information with them. It's not for me, but it's for everybody. I think it's a privilege that we have, that we can kind of move through society, without having being discriminated, at face value. But at the same time, it's also this thing of sometimes you have to hide who you are. And I'll be honest, I was very nervous about doing this table talk because there are a lot of people who, have major issues and will discriminate once they know you are from a particular culture or race. So I was concerned. I was concerned for my safety. I was concerned for my career, thinking that maybe, there were people who were just gonna not want to, work with me. These are real concerns in this day and age.
And Nikki, I think this is the exact reason why we have these conversations. This entire conversation has really opened up a good dialogue to understanding more and to dispel the stereotypes and debunk those things, to understand from your perspective and from Haya's perspective and from Nina's perspective, your experience when it comes to this exact question. And so, ladies, we're going to wrap up with our last question soon, but I think, Wendy, you wanted to jump in, and then Haya before we get to our last question.
Right. I was just going to, piggyback on what you said, Danielle, that Nikki, this is what DEI is about. These are what these tough conversations are about, because if we don't have them among ourselves as clinicians and people involved in our business, then what good are we doing for our clients? And, I kind of relate to you when you said, I want to be that one Iranian person that this person says isn't a terrorist or a horrible human being. And being a Black woman, that's pretty much my day to day. Like, I try to say to people, look, Black people aren't like this as you think they are. We have a lot to contribute. We have a lot of skills. We are educated. We are family people. We love our children. We're exactly what you are as well. So that's all I wanted to comment on that. But I'm so happy that all of you have been able to participate in this conversation, and I don't think people will look at you differently.
Thank you.
I could relate so much to Nikki. I didn't know, honestly. I didn't know where. I don't know most of you because we don't see each other.
Right.
But I could relate so much to you, Nikki. We were, yes, Palestinian, were displaced. We moved around, and we are educated. We are accomplished people. We are smart people. We're fighters. We're not terrorists. We fight for freedom. We fight for peace, for land, for our children and families. And but I do want to say something funny that when the Trump era happened, my husband and my kids were worried about and concerned about my safety, especially after the 7th Street incident and the 26th incident. And then my husband goes, I don't mind. I mean, I don't care if you take your scarf off. And the kids don't have to say they're Muslim at the school. They don't have to say anything. I mean, this is getting serious.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm not really religious. I'm not very good practicing Muslim. I am a Muslim. I said, but this is an identity. Honestly, to me, this is my personal opinion. My hijab is my identity. When I go out, people look at me and say, yeah, she's Muslim. They don't know the difference if I am Arabi or Iranian or Turkish. They don't know. She's Muslim. And I'm very proud of that. I do want to be different. I do want to people point out at me. People need to get educated. But this also doesn't mean that I am a terrorist too.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I remember one time somebody asked me where I am from. I don't see clients like you guys. I only talk to them over the phone, and they're like, "Your accent is interesting. Where are you from?" And when I say I'm from the Middle East, oh, don't worry, we don't hate you. We only hate the terrorist ones. Like, okay, well, whatever. So it is what it is. I am very proud where I come from, and I am an American. I live in America, and I am America offered us a lot of opportunities, and we worked so hard.
Exactly. Exactly.
Thank you, Haya, for even that short story. And we could actually have a whole longer conversation, even about your experiences over the past 4 years. There are several things that I've taken away from everyone. And there's another thing that, if those who are watching, there's this idea of entitlement from a different lens, from a different perspective, even if it's from white spaces. This is almost a conversation to say, examine yourself, examine your thoughts. What lens do you view other races and other cultures through? And through this conversation, has it changed your mind? Or are you willing and open to have the conversation like we've had the conversation today? And so I thank you, ladies, for just being open and just being transparent about your thoughts and your feelings about this conversation. Before we go, though, I want to know, what would you say to those who are watching, or even to clients, or those who are just intrigued by this conversation? If it's something, a positive note, or a word of advice, or a little bit more insight into who you are and this conversation, what will be one of the last things you would tell those watching today?
I would say learn. get exposure and learn. You know, if you don't know about a culture, we have the internet at our fingertips. You can learn anything. And if you meet someone from another culture, learn about them, get to know them. You know, they're not scary monsters because they are the other. They don't fit into the white box, you know, or the black box, or, you know, one race. I think knowledge is power. And then after you learn, share that information with others so we can spread, you know, this new perspective that every person is, first of all, an individual human being. We're not stereotypes, we're not put in boxes, you know, we shouldn't be put in boxes. So that's what I would say.
Excellent.
I think I would say something like, I guess I'm like speaking to the youth now, but like, like, I don't know, like you get to identify how you want to identify. I mean, there's going to be so many people in your life telling you who you are, what you deserve, like what makes you okay, like what things you do that are acceptable and not. And I think at the end of the day, I mean, so much of my experiences in Middle Eastern was just finally coming to this place of like, okay, I'm going to identify how I want to identify. And some people are going to look at me and call me white, and some people are going to look at me and call me a terrorist, and some people are going to look at me and call me whatever. But like at the end of the day, like I'm really proud, like Haya said, I think we're really proud. Like be proud of what your identities are, and don't let other people telling you what you are and like make it what you get to be. Like if you want to identify as Swana, you go ahead. If you want to identify as Middle Eastern, go ahead. If you want to identify as white, you go ahead. Like that's your choice. Like identity is really, really personal and really, really beautiful. And like you get to make those choices, and they don't only have to be informed by the negative. They don't have to only be informed by like racism, you know, because I think a lot of people's identity end up being informed by racism. Get in, like, form your identities based on your culture and happiness and things that make you feel good about yourself. I don't know if that made sense, but that feels important to me.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Haya?
Nikki, 100%. I agree with you. I always said that, and I always teach my kids education. Educate yourself. Learn. Google. When I first started here and I knew Vera was Armenian, I was curious about Armenia. I didn't know much about it. Google, learn, and teach others.
Yeah.
Excellent. And Wendy?
Mine's pretty simple. Have a conversation, ask a question. And I piggyback on Nikki as well, Haya and Nina. Be who you are. Be proud of that, and celebrate it. And take the opportunity, if someone asks you a question, not so much to get offended by whatever they ask you, but give them some knowledge. I think all of us have the opportunity to educate someone out of ignorance. And so, you know, when people, I think we talked about it on a past table talk about just Black hair. That's a big thing with Black women. And, you know, when you ask those questions, not offended, why would you know about Black hair? You're not Black. But I'll teach you about it, or I'll educate you about it so that you understand all the nuances and beauty in Black hair. So that's just an example. So for me, it's just really ask a question, have a conversation, get some food, sit down and talk. So easy.
May I say something that is very positive when it comes to learning and education? So I found out yesterday from a client who goes to high school in Montgomery County that the high school, for one of the English classes, they have been given a graphic novel called Persepolis. And it was written by an Iranian woman writer. And it's her biography about, you know, the revolution in Iran and having to move out and adapt and acclimate. And I think that is, when we're talking about, you know, teaching about other cultures and their experiences, I was so surprised and so proud that the school has chosen this book, you know, this graphic novel to inform our youth, you know, about other cultures. So just wanted to end on a positive note that hopefully, you know, in certain small ways we are moving to the right direction of
Actually,
global.
and if we're resource dropping, because I think if we're telling people to learn, let's give them some places to learn. There's a really amazing book called Whitewashed, and it's about the Middle Eastern experience in the United States. It's by a half Iranian, half Armenian guy, and about his experience and the way in which sort of Middle Easterns have been seen in the United States, like through the lens of like sort of color in the United States, called Whitewashed by John Tehranian. So
Wait,
yeah, check it out.
Whitewashed by who?
John Tehranian.
Okay, thank you.
All right, excellent. So we know, let's have the conversation. Let's educate ourselves. Let's learn and be open to learn. We've already had some wonderful resources that have been spoken in this episode. So ladies, Haya, Nikki, Wendy, Nina, thank you so much for being here today. And until next time, this is ABH's DEI Committee Table Talk. We'll see you next time for another exciting topic.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you, Danielle.